Imagine your country's money, the thing you use every day, suddenly bought half as much as it did a generation ago. Your savings melt. Soldiers stop taking pay in the currency. Borders are still manned, but the state cannot fund the men who guard them. This isn't a story about invasions or rebellions. It's a story about money killing empires from the inside. Over 2,000 years, four great powers followed the same fatal script. Today, the same warning signs are flashing again. What you're about to hear is not speculation. It's a pattern. If you follow it to the end, you'll understand how currency can end an empire and why that matters to all of us now. We think of empires falling because of battles, tanks, or revolutions. That's the dramatic version. But there's a quieter, colder mechanism that has done the most damage across history: the collapse of trust in money. When a currency fails, every contract, salary, tax, and pension that depends on it starts to unwind. Roads stop being repaired. Armies stop being paid. Markets freeze. Whole political orders rearrange themselves. Today, I'll take you through the exact sequence that brought down Rome, then Spain, then Britain, and why the same sequence is happening now on a global scale. At its height, Rome seemed unbeatable. A single coin, the denarius, backed the trust that Greeks, Egyptians, and Britons used to trade. For centuries, the denarius actually contained significant silver. When people accepted it, they knew its value. That predictability underpinned the empire. But empires are expensive. Every new territory added scanners, forts, roads, governors, and soldiers. To pay for expansion and luxuries, Rome's rulers started reducing the silver in the coin. At first it was small, a margin shaved off. That let the state mint more coins from the same bullion and pay short-term bills. But the effect was cumulative. Over generations, coins became lighter and lighter in real silver. Prices began to rise. Wages lagged. Contracts fixed in nominal coin became worthless in real buying power. When soldiers began to refuse pay in the debased currency, and farmers demanded payment in grain or barter instead of coins, the market's gears seized. Tax collectors could no longer collect what the state needed, and the army, the core of Roman power, could not be maintained. The denarius was still stamped with the emperor's face, but its real value had evaporated. By the time political order fractured, the currency had already hollowed out the state's capacity. Rome didn't fall in a single siege. It slipped away as money lost meaning. Key lesson from Rome: debasing what everyone accepts as value destroys the incentives that keep a complex polity running. Centuries later, Spain discovered what seemed like a cure-all: mountains of New World silver. Silver ships returned with treasure enough to dazzle all of Europe. For a while, Spain looked unstoppable. Money flowed, the crown paid armies, the court prospered. But here's the paradox. Piling up more of a commodity that serves as money doesn't make the economy stronger if the underlying productive base isn't growing. Spain exported raw silver, but imported finished goods. Factories and new industries weren't being built at the same rate. Even worse, injecting an enormous supply of silver across Europe raised prices everywhere. That's inflation. Instead of becoming permanently rich, Spain found that the silver made everyday commerce more expensive, and the state reliant on continual inflows. When the monarchy piled on debts to fund wars and royal spending, lenders eventually refused to trust Spanish bonds. The crown defaulted multiple times. Each default reduced the credit available to the state and forced further shortcuts, cutting the silver content in coins, printing promises, and issuing dubious currency. Confidence collapsed. A kingdom that once commanded seas and trade suddenly could not afford its own commitments. Key lesson from Spain: resource windfalls can be ruinous when they substitute for broad-based productivity and when rulers mistake inflows for sustainable wealth. Fast forward to Britain. For 2 centuries, the pound sterling was the backbone of global trade. Its convertible link to gold and the City of London's financial muscle gave Britain extraordinary leverage. Credit flowed. Financing empire felt routine. But global war changed everything. World War I required massive borrowing and, crucially, suspension of gold convertibility. The state printed and borrowed at scale to defeat a very dangerous enemy. Post-war attempts to return to old norms, like re-establishing the pre-war gold parity, ended up inflicting pain on the economy. The pound was overvalued. Exports suffered. Later, World War II's even greater costs left Britain saturated in debt and reliant on American credit. With debt towering and economic capacity weakened, Britain lost effective reserve status. Devaluations followed, and the confidence in sterling that once powered global trade eroded. Between the rising bill for maintaining global commitments and the shrinking means to pay them, imperial obligations became unsustainable. Colonies that no longer benefited from British rule began to assert independence. An empire built on global financial trust shrank when that trust frayed. The key lesson from Britain: global credit and reserve status can be lost quickly after sustained large deficits, and losing that status changes geopolitics. When we look at the histories of Rome, Spain, and Britain, a clear pattern emerges, one that repeats itself almost like clockwork. This is not speculation or theory, it's a sequence driven by economics and human behavior. At the height of an empire, when its military is unmatched and its currency is trusted worldwide, it feels invincible. But this very peak sets the stage for the unraveling. As the empire stretches beyond its means, taking on more territory, more soldiers, more administration, the demand for resources grows faster than the coffers can handle. To cover these rising costs, governments borrow heavily, and often they print money to meet obligations. This increase in money supply triggers inflation. Prices rise, the value of earnings diminishes, and suddenly the currency that once commanded trust no longer buys the same goods or services. Over time, citizens and foreign allies alike start losing faith in the money they once relied on. The entire economic system begins to strain. Taxes become harder to collect. Armies demand payment in tangible assets rather than worthless coins, and commerce slows. Eventually, the breakdown spreads beyond finance, destabilizing politics and social structures as well. History shows that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to this process. The downfall doesn't require sudden invasions, revolutions, or plagues. The real culprit is the erosion of trust in the currency itself, coupled with unsustainable spending. The math is simple. You cannot spend more than you earn indefinitely, and you cannot create lasting prosperity by printing money. Every empire that ignored this reality, Rome, Spain, Britain, paid the ultimate price. This pattern repeats with striking accuracy, and recognizing it is the key to understanding how even the mightiest powers can crumble from within. Money functions because people believe it will be accepted tomorrow at roughly the same value as it did today. That social contract enables contracts, wages, taxes, and investment. When that belief cracks, the methods people use to protect themselves multiply: barter, foreign currencies, gold, or hoarding real assets. The administrative engine of a state, tax collection, social services, armies, relies on predictable money. For a polity that outsources much of its financing to credit markets and whose global standing depends on a reserve currency role, the erosion of confidence compounds quickly. Foreign creditors stop lending cheaply. Domestic savers demand protection. Political leaders face pressure to choose between austerity, which causes social pain, or more monetary expansion, which accelerates inflation and undermines trust. Both options carry severe costs. This is where attention turns to the present. For decades, the US dollar has been the main global reserve currency. That status confers enormous advantages: cheaper borrowing, global liquidity, and leverage in international finance. The United States also supports an unprecedented global network of presence and commitments.
Military spending, social commitments, and a large domestic economy create constant demand for financing. The modern policy toolkit, central banks, quantitative easing, and global capital markets give policymakers more tools than ever to respond to crises. But those tools change the dynamics. Printing money or expanding reserves can stabilize markets short term, but they also increase the supply of nominal units relative to real goods. When real supply cannot keep pace with nominal demand, prices rise.
When governments accumulate structural deficits over time, the risk to long-term confidence rises. History doesn't require identical mechanisms to repeat, only the same economic logic. When a political entity consistently spends more than it produces and monetizes the gap, the sequence we've traced becomes a realistic risk. The question is timing and severity, a controlled decline, a messy collapse, or a systemic reset. History shows us that when empires reach the breaking point, there are essentially three paths they tend to follow, each with very different consequences. The first is a controlled decline. In this scenario, the empire gradually loses its dominance, its currency weakens, and its global influence diminishes. But the society itself survives. Britain, after World War II, is a perfect example. The empire had lost its war footing and its position as the world's financial center. The pound had been devalued, and inflation surged. Yet, the nation endured. It became a second-tier power, facing slow, often humiliating decline, but it did not disappear. Life continued, economies adjusted, and the country retained its identity, albeit in a diminished form. The second path is chaotic collapse, which is far more destructive. This is what happened to Rome in the 5th century. Once the denarius lost its value and the government could no longer pay its legions or maintain order, the empire fragmented, society unraveled, and Europe plunged into the Dark Ages. This outcome represents the worst-case scenario, a total systemic breakdown that is economic, political, and social all at once. The empire doesn't just lose wealth, it loses cohesion, authority, and the very structures that hold it together. The third possible outcome is reset and restructuring. Here, the old system collapses, but a new one emerges in its place. A new currency may be introduced, potentially backed by gold or by a mix of national currencies. Sometimes the global financial order is redesigned entirely. History offers examples of new reserve currencies rising to replace old ones, or digital and alternative systems being created to restore stability. This process is painful and often slow, but it is survivable, and it lays the foundation for future growth and stability. For the United States, these historical outcomes serve as a cautionary map. The debt cannot be repaid at current levels. The money supply is rapidly expanding, and political consensus for corrective action is lacking. Default would destroy confidence in the dollar almost instantly. Inflation is already eroding the currency's purchasing power, and restructuring would require bold, coordinated action. Unlike Rome, Spain, or Britain, the US dollar is the global reserve currency, so any disruption will have worldwide consequences. Yet, as history shows, the fate of empires is rarely determined by military power alone. Economic reality and the trust people place in currency ultimately dictate whether a nation declines gradually, collapses chaotically, or finds a way to reset and endure. There's a crucial difference between a large imperial currency failing and a smaller one failing. When Rome's denarius collapsed, the damage was concentrated within its sphere. When Spain's silver inflated Europe, it affected trade across the continent, but was still limited. Today, the dominant currency is woven into global trade, finance, and central bank reserves. A significant shock to such a currency ricochets through global trade, investment, and cross-border banking exposures. That means the stakes are higher and the feedback loops faster. Loss of confidence spreads more quickly because many countries and institutions are directly exposed. That magnifies the importance of credible policy and orderly transitions. When it comes to understanding the health of an empire, the signs are not always dramatic headlines. They often appear quietly, hidden in the details of everyday economics. One of the first things to watch is the behavior of the currency itself. When trust in money starts to waver, It shows up in inflation that feels relentless, even when governments insist it's temporary. The cost of essentials, food, housing, healthcare, begins to rise faster than wages, and ordinary people start feeling the pinch. Another key indicator is debt. When government spending consistently exceeds revenue, deficits grow year after year, and borrowing becomes the default method for keeping the system afloat. It signals that the empire is living beyond its means. At the same time, international behavior provides clues. Other nations begin diversifying away from that currency, exploring alternative payment systems, buying gold or strengthening trade in their own money, which gradually reduces the global influence of what was once a dominant financial standard. Military overextension is another warning sign. Maintaining thousands of bases worldwide, funding endless overseas engagements, and running massive defense budgets without sustainable backing add strain to the economy. Taken together, these indicators, rising inflation, mounting debt, declining global confidence, and overextended military commitments, paint a clear picture of an empire under pressure. They don't tell the precise timing of a collapse, but they highlight the direction, the risks, and the lessons history has repeated countless times. When an empire ignores these signals, the consequences are unavoidable. When empires face economic pressure and the warning signs of collapse, governments rarely stand still. They respond, sometimes decisively, sometimes in ways that only delay the inevitable. One common approach is to borrow more. By issuing bonds or taking on debt, leaders hope to cover immediate expenses, fund military operations, or maintain social programs, all while convincing the public and international partners that stability persists. Another response is currency manipulation. Governments may devalue their money, adjust interest rates, or increase the money supply in an attempt to stimulate growth, pay debts, or manage inflation. While these tactics can work in the short term, history shows that overuse often accelerates the decline rather than preventing it. In more extreme situations, governments attempt to restructure, introducing new currencies, renegotiating debts, or creating alternative financial systems to restore trust. These measures are complex, politically charged, and require careful coordination because any misstep can further erode confidence both domestically and internationally. The challenge is that the responses themselves carry risks. Borrowing increases future obligations, currency debasement triggers inflation, and restructuring can provoke panic if not managed properly. Yet, despite the risks, governments have few options once the foundational trust in currency begins to unravel. The pattern is clear. The more desperate the measures, the greater the historical evidence that the empire is teetering on the edge of collapse. Observing how these responses are applied and how effectively they maintain public and international confidence provides a critical insight into whether a nation can navigate its economic challenges or if it is simply delaying the inevitable collapse that history has repeated time and time again. When a currency declines, ordinary lives are affected first in daily budgets. Food, housing, energy. Savers see real value fall. Workers demand higher wages. Governments fight inflation with policies that often cause short-term pain. Knowing the sequence doesn't let you predict exact timing, but it helps you prepare, diversify holdings, understand exposure to currency risk, and be mindful of real assets and skills that retain value. One final point. History is not destiny. The pattern repeats because of basic arithmetic and incentives, but decisions by leaders, institutions, and citizens change outcomes. Empires fell when leaders repeatedly chose short-term fixes over long-term reform. Where policymakers accept painful but necessary reforms early, the path can be redirected from collapse to controlled adjustment. The true uncomfortable lesson is simple. You cannot spend forever what you don't produce, and you cannot pretend trust is permanent. If you want to understand a nation's long-term power, look not only at armies and technologies, but at its fiscal habits and the credibility of its money. As you walk away from this video, ask 3 clear questions about any large power today or tomorrow. Is it running structural deficits that are unlikely to decline?
Is it monetizing those deficits or depending on creditors who might lose patience? Do foreign holders still trust the currency enough to keep using it? If the answer to all three is yes for an extended period, the seven-stage sequence is a realistic risk. That's what history teaches and what should make every informed citizen pay attention. If this analysis gave you a sharper way to see the forces that shape nations and markets, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the updates as events unfold. Thanks for listening.